Hello and welcome to CaliberMind's DIY attribution series, where we share what we've learned over time to help you get through attribution a little bit easier, or maybe decide to outsource the project, as the case may be. I'm joined today by Misha. Misha, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure, be happy to. I am a director of customer data strategy, which means I operate somewhere in the realm between raw data and outcomes for our customers. And so we often work directly with customers. My background is both in marketing and data. So kind of have experienced some of the pains we're going to be chatting about back in my early marketing days.
Perfect. So during this series, we've had a lot of conversations about requirements gathering and how you need to set things up differently depending on what you're trying to do. And we've also talked about data hygiene best practices. And the next evolution to that made sense for me was to talk a little bit about where we're going to be pulling that data from and maybe pushing it to. When we're thinking about analyzing data, to me, it makes sense to put it in one location. Does that make sense as a concept?
Sure, absolutely. And what that looks like in terms of level of complexity can certainly vary. Mm-hmm. So we can envision a situation where data sits in the CRM, and we've discussed previously some attribution solutions that could plug into that and some of the both benefits and challenges of that. And then that can become much more complex, right? As we know, touch points coming from various sources, and data could be sitting in something like a data warehouse, both in its raw form and already a post-processed normalized data set as well.
So when I think of, what are some of the signs you've seen that kind of tell you this doesn't really make sense in the CRM anymore? We should maybe move this to something like a data lake or data warehouse. Are there certain red flags where you think, modeling this might be easier elsewhere?
Very interesting question, because I'm not sure this is always driven by the end user. What I've experienced more is that there are other teams that say, hey, guess what? We need this unified data set. And guess what, marketing? You now can utilize this if you want. And so from my experience, these often data gets dumped into a data lake without necessarily understanding how to use it subsequently. Right. So that's just from a past experience. If there was a moment, though, that was driven by the marketing team, I would say it would align with the maturity of the organization, one that starts tracking more, understanding that, wait a second, web activity or email activity is an important part of our buyer journey, or perhaps even sales activities. And we realize that right now we're only reporting on these campaign members, so really isolated events. Well, if we want to incorporate and have a more realistic buyer journey, that's when we're starting to talk about data from different sources, in which point something like a data lake would be much more fitting.
And I like a couple of things you said there, because as a longtime Salesforce admin, like a long time when they first started as a company, I would have people ask me to do things that made sense to them. And I'm like, you have exceeded the limits of what is possible in this tool. And we're pretty constrained by the number of joins we can have when it comes to reports, how much processing we can borrow from Salesforce, and how many objects removed we can be when we're calculating something. So what you mentioned, that just checked all the boxes for me. You're talking about we've exceeded the capabilities of the tool we have, and we're just not able to report on all the things we want to at once. But if we are using something like Salesforce, let's say campaign influence, getting data from other systems, it's always interesting to me. I've seen some admins replicate sales activity into campaign members because the tool they use for attribution just looked at that. And I've seen them also consider pushing web activity into those objects.
Yeah, the trouble is always in the details, though, right? It's always I've seen these things happen, and we've helped support a number of customers with similar efforts, and it's always like, oh, guess what, this flag was set incorrectly, or these dates, and it's in these details that things seem to go right. So there are flexibility in these tools. I have seen these events get incorporated or tasks in as campaign members to be able to enable attribution. And so it's possible, but there are a lot of caveats, and we've discussed some of those about the limitations of the end reporting that is available within those tools themselves.
Right. And I think, especially as a Salesforce admin, as you said, a lot of this is probably driven by the people either on the BI team, the business as a whole, or the technical people dealing with the tools. When you're storing a lot of information, say website interactions, you can hit data limits that you didn't think was possible to hit before and run into some additional costs you didn't anticipate.
Yeah, excellent point. Excellent point. And then also, I think we might talk about this a little bit, but normalization of the data is a very, very big part of having useful and meaningful reports, and having, for example, people on the granularity of job titles that you have in your CRM probably will not make it be easy to have title or job level or department level reporting. So you can write formulas, but these will be very, very messy to do, I believe, inside a CRM. Oh, so that might be another moment where you say, is there an external resource in which we can utilize for this?
Right. Character limits and formulas are really problematic when you're talking about something like you mentioned, normalizing titles. There's so many different variations. I think another interesting aspect of what you mentioned earlier, too, is when you decide to incorporate something like sales or website data, if you're backfilling it into the campaign member, that's the response date, unless you build in some functionality to be able to backfill those dates. Yeah. So there's a lot of gotchas out there.
Exactly. The details. Yep.
So when we're talking about putting things into any one place, whether it's your CRM or a data warehouse, what are some of those things you have to think about in terms of transferring that information?
Yeah, I think today there are tools out there that make it easier. Previously, it was a lot of APIs, and you'd have to have individual development with every single source.
Right, webhooks and Marketo, API connections, and Salesforce. Yeah,
precisely. Yeah. So luckily, there are shortcuts today, or there are tools. They're costly tools, but tools nonetheless that can help you transition that data into a data warehouse. And typically, you'd get the raw data. Now, even in working with such tools, and we have a lot of experience with that at CaliberMind, there are situations in which if that's done without vetting or without selecting which objects come through, you can have a very big, costly data ballooning issue. So just one thing I'd bear in mind. And then also sometimes there are sources which, many of these solutions have incorporated connectors to Salesforce or connectors to Marketo and HubSpot. But many times, our marketing data sits in spreadsheets, and you have to find ways to incorporate that in as well. So do not forget that you might have really interesting data that would be very meaningful to your team's reporting, sitting in SFTP or drive somewhere that you would also want to incorporate.
Yeah, and I think a lot of reasons why we move to a data warehouse is to reduce some of the maintenance that continually goes on when we're trying to maintain that stuff in spreadsheets. A lot of times, though, the issues we face when we're trying to manage data in spreadsheets gets a bit amplified. And what I mean by that is, for connecting to a tool or putting stuff in a spreadsheet, we need to find a way to map the data together. Like, do we have a Salesforce ID that we can reference or something along those lines? I think if people are struggling to maintain the data today, they can anticipate needing to navigate those same hurdles when they set up a data connector or a data lake or a data warehouse.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the different skill sets. You mentioned some of these tools are a lot easier. When I'm trying to think through, you mentioned a lot of tools like Salesforce have connectors. There are some fairly simple to use data workflow tools like Zapier is one of them. There's a few like that. There's Fivetran for data warehouse connectivity. And then there's building your own API, which takes development resources. Do you typically see the same person doing all of those things, responsible for the data, analyzing it, and then reporting it? Or do you see these functions split up a little bit? Like, I know a lot of us are dealing with constrained resources and doing the best we can with what we have, but ideally, how would a team that supports this be structured?
Yeah, there are. It's important to bear in mind, I think, the end users and what we're trying to accomplish. So what data is even needed in there. And I've seen situations in which there have been a lot of kind of marketing end users, a lot of requirements for what they would like to see. And some data gets pushed in there, but there really wasn't enough of a technical resource in order to be able to normalize the data, to be able to create unique keys across tables, to not have duplicate data and ballooning and have nonsensical reporting. On the other end, not having enough end user inputs or really people who ultimately want to make sense of this data, is that you create reports that aren't very meaningful to the board, to the CMO, and you end up having a lot of data in there, which is noise, which could be just as problematic. You know, we often have customers coming our way saying, you know, we've tried this, but we just can't get internal buy-in. And we say, well, is the data there? Yeah, well, we actually have a centralized data warehouse. It's all in there. It's all in there, but I cannot show my CMO anything of value. So I do think that not only does it require different skill sets, it requires those skill sets, those people to really communicate well with each other, get an understanding of what is available, what is possible, even with the data, where data might be duplicated. Oh, guess what? We merged Marketo to Salesforce. So having those two as two unique systems in our data warehouse, yes, all the data is there, but you're actually duplicating it. So like that has to be talked through and built into any sort of work you do with the data between the raw data and the reporting layer.
That's so smart. The way people have to collaborate, gather requirements, translate those requirements, figure out what matters and what doesn't. But something you touched on briefly that I'd like to get into a little bit more is that identity graphing. Can you kind of explain the concept to me?
Sure. Is this in relation to the job titles we mentioned earlier?
So more identity graphing, like you mentioned this briefly, where you're trying to find a key to map all of the different systems together. So like creating a golden account and contact record in that event timeline. Yeah,
that's something that I think as all of us are trying to make sense of marketing data, we've probably been different attempts to do this. And there are various levels at which this can be done. We can just take the tagging, for example. Let's say we want to organize data on the account level. We can just say, well, anyone who's directly tagged under this account will go into that bucket. But in that case, we might be missing a lot of activity on the buyer journey for that organization. So then maybe a deeper layer could say, well, maybe we look at keys like domains, and we can say, well, we can say anybody at ibm.com. We can group that way. But then that brings up a whole nother set of questions of, well, there could be geographical differences, right? And there could be very large organizations that have locations across. So how do we identify it then? Where do we how do you make a decision if we were to place this individual's activity into a buyer journey? Which of these 15 different buyer journeys or buying committees should those touches go into? So all of these I think are very important questions. And again, if there could be assumptions being made by one team that is implementing this, that if not discussed properly, can result in some nonsensical or less useful reports or insights.
And what I like about what you just said is identity graphing that takes place within your CRM is just part of this too. So you're talking about maybe leads and accounts and how things are separated there. If we step back a minute and look at the other systems we're trying to maybe incorporate, like web touches, you've got maybe IP addresses, or maybe you don't have that much. They're just supplying an email on a form. So figuring out how all the different systems talk about people, it's just kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's a little bit of an art. And that's where I know we're talking today about the science behind this, how the data flows, but it really is just important to remember the utility of this at the end and what we're trying to accomplish. So yes, you can make data look really pretty, but it could still be nonsensical.
So what I'm hearing is get a really good idea of what the end state, the end desired state is, and then kind of work backwards. So we're gathering our requirements, we're figuring out which data is important and what isn't. And then we're figuring out how to push it into this place and then connect it all together. What people don't think about a lot, let's talk a little bit about change management. So let's say marketing was using one direct mail tool. Now they use a completely different one, or maybe they switch marketing automation platforms. What kind of wrinkles does that introduce to your existing attribution model? I know it's a loaded question, but
it is. I guess the only common factor in all of them is I've never seen it go smoothly. As a matter of fact, I think it's one of the moments that we've seen customers come to us and just ask for help. So we're going through this and we realize that we are unable to make this transition smoothly. And this is just a concept I think I would like to mention here. I think it's important that we just noted as part of this conversation, the idea of ETL versus ELT, and that, I personally am a fairly big believer in having the raw data and having access to it, even though we can then process it and create more normalized, standardized data. But when you're going through something like this, you often want to validate, well, one second, how was my reporting last Q1? Can I even look at that? And if we're just saying, well, we're going to start at scratch from this new marketing automation platform, you're basically starting from scratch. Somebody made a decision. Okay, we're going to transfer some contacts over, some members. We might not have. We might have started from scratch altogether. And typically with marketing reporting, we want to know how trends are going, right? How things are going over time. And so it's important to have access to what we've had before, potentially. And so it is another, I think, very major benefit of having a data warehouse or another solution that gives you access to be able to connect, previous raw data to new one, or perhaps even being a partner in this transition that can help validate, saying, here's a set of contacts that weren't there and are here. Oh yeah, we forgot this rule. We should have probably incorporated into this transition.
Yes, and I've been on all sides of this where I was the person maintaining the data warehouse. I was the person who was frustrated because the people maintaining didn't have time but every time there was any kind of tool change, it had to be, new tables had to be created. That information had to be mapped to everything that's already existing. And then we have to figure out how to integrate it into our attribution models and what we want to compare it to. And I heard you mention all of those things.
Yeah, and if your reporting layer is looking directly at those tools, and say you're reporting on leads created directly from Marketo, you decide to make a decision to go to HubSpot, your reporting layer is blown. And there's very very little chance that whatever you're going to have post this migration is going to look anything like what you had previously. So I think it's another vote as to why it would be good to build your reporting layer off of standardized tables that are post-processing, right? That like take any input, process into a normalized version, and then you can build a reporting layer off of that. It makes any such change, major change of software be much less problematic.
I am so glad you brought that up, because that is something that's easy to overlook until you've lost your historical data set. And suddenly you can't report on MQLs or pipeline or a lot of things anymore because that stuff isn't tied together. I think another caution I would put out there is if you're using installed packages and relying on them, when you uninstall that package in Salesforce, that data and those fields are gone. So having some place to make a backup, I'm so glad you brought that up because it's really important.
Yeah, it's things we've felt and experienced and helped teams work through them.
So what I'm hearing, just talking through it again, we start at the end. We know what we want to get out of this. Then we work backwards, figure out what data we include. And then there's that change management piece that is forever ongoing. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we close up this session?
Just to speak, I think to both the skill set and the number of actors involved. As part of a project like this, I highly recommend to speak to organizations that have either gone through this or speak with us. I'm happy to share without the context of CaliberMind, but just what it would take to go through some of this, because I think there are pitfalls that could easily be avoided. And just with the right planning, I would be very cautious if a project like this, if we say, okay, we need this, so we're going to implement this data warehouse, so we're going to flow all this data, and then we'll figure it out. That is typically a big red flag. And so I would just recommend on the onset of such a project and decision and just thinking through what a reporting infrastructure would look like, just have those internal conversations. I think it'll save you a whole lot of time and headache on the back end.
Yeah, and I think we've all been part of a project where we thought we knew what the person wanted. We did all that work, and then we were upset because they didn't adopt it. Yeah. What you're suggesting can cut out so much of that heartache. If we can figure out what all people want to use it for up front, maybe we can get in front of, oh, shoot, we need different models based on what these different people want to do. Or maybe the model we were going down doesn't make sense because they're focused more on this thing, So I think that's just really great advice. Yeah.
And one other thing that just came to mind is if you do go the route of doing this internally, it will take you longer, but I think it's very important to take it as one new data source at a time. I think incorporating many at the same time in addition to a model can make it much more difficult to understand, to parse where issues might be happening. And so, again, I think it's a kind of time cost analysis that has to go into this. But once you're doing this internally and you realize what you want the normalized data to look like, try to connect and work through one source at a time and say, okay, right now we're going to add web visits to the formula as well. And let's add, emails as well. One source at a time could be much more useful. Likely with something like CaliberMind, we've thought through all of this, so it does mean it could save you a lot of time potentially because all of that logic is built in. But if building internally, just one lesson I've learned is take it one source at a time, one project at a time.
And document it, because I've also learned that if people don't understand why something's there and they rip it out, they lose so much more than they anticipate. So if it's documented really clearly, maybe they won't rip it out. Maybe they still will, but at least you did your due diligence and somebody can't say, hey, remember that, jackass.
Right on.
Not speaking from experience at all. Misha, thank you so much. So if people want to reach out to you to ask questions about their own project, where's a great place to find you?
Yeah, Misha at CaliberMind or LinkedIn, Misha Salkinder. Be happy to chat through any and all things marketing analytics.
Love it. Thank you so much. And for those of you listening, check out the rest of our series. We're going to have some great upcoming episodes as well. And for more great content like this, check out CaliberMind.com.